Okay, welcome back to our afternoon session. Sometimes in life, you as fathers may feel a bit overwhelmed with all the responsibilities and duties that come your way, and I know that feeling as a father myself. It is a huge job. It's the job that sometimes we wish we could pass off to someone else, but as I mentioned before, God has invested His gifts to us to do His will. Maybe sometimes we feel like old Jim here. The poem that I was blessed to know about just recently. It's called Rise Above the Circumstances, and I'll read it to you. Old Jim had been a faithful horse, but he was growing old. So Uncle Lem made up his mind the horse should not be sold, but turned out in the pasture land to roam and feed at will, or rest beneath the shady trees down by the water still. Lem loved his faithful servant Jim and watched him day by day, and when he whistled to his horse, Jim gave an answering neigh. One day the horse had disappeared, so Lem went out to see what had become of faithful Jim. Where could that creature be? Lem thought of an abandoned well which had uncovered been. He hurried down the path to see, yes, Jim had fallen in. If he had tried to pull him out, a leg might broken be, so he would go and get his gun and end Jim's misery. Lem brought the gun, but couldn't bear to shoot old faithful Jim, so brought a shovel and pick with which to bury him. Lem took a shovel full of dirt and rolled it in the well. It slid down the horse's back and to the bottom fell. As fast as every load was sent, the horse would stump it down, and as they both thus worked away, at last the well was gone. Out jumped the horse, all whole and sound, kicked up his heels and ran. Let's get from out this simple tale a moral if we can. When people try to crush us down and cover us with dirt, let's stomp it underneath our feet and never let it hurt. Let's be like Jim and rise above the troubles that beset. If we are on the side of right, we'll gain the victory yet. So I wanted to share that with us as a means of encouragement, and hopefully we can be like that when situations arise that we do not know how to handle, that we are then able to just allow it to hit us on the back full side, and then we are able to rise up with those challenges, because those challenges that come our way often will be the means of us becoming better fathers. Now, if we can get back to where we are starting from, we'll get started on this afternoon's session. We're going to look this afternoon now at another part of the mandate that is to each of us fathers, and that is what I have called the father's mantle. And if you will recall the story of Elijah having been the prophet of God, and then he knew that his time of departure was close at hand, and so he wanted to choose a man that would take up the mantle and would take up the responsibility of becoming the man of God for God's people. And so when Elisha was going to be the one chosen, he was following Elijah around for a while. They came to the river, and Elijah rolled up his mantle and he struck the river, and the waters parted, and then they were able to go across, and then they came back to the other side. Sometime after that, Elisha was given the privilege of asking Elijah, his mentor, his predecessor, "What would you like from me?" And so Elisha answered that question by saying, "I would like a double portion of your spirit." And Elijah told him that's a hard thing to give, but if certain circumstances happen at my departure, if you see me, etc., then you will know that the wish will be granted to you. And so it says that when the time came for Elijah to depart, he was taken up in a chariot of fire, the horses, and that whole story. But something was left behind. It says that when Elisha saw him go, and he gave that declaration, such as the the chariots of Israel and the horsemen thereof. But Elijah was gone. He was not there to mentor him any longer. But he looked around, and the mantle that Elijah had used to part the river was laying there on the ground. Now Elisha then had a responsibility or a choice to make. Does he really want to be empowered with that request that he had made? And so he reached down and picked up that mantle. Now here's where the acid test comes into being. He went to that same river that he saw others, and Andrew was talking about other great people, other men of God, other preachers that we always think of. They were the great men. Always somebody else. But now Elisha is coming to the point, will I be able to do what other great men of God did? And so he picks up that mantle, walks up to that water, strikes that water, and the water is divided. He went across. Now the point that I want to make is this. There is a mantle that we as fathers are meant to pick up. We are meant to bear the mantle. Now a mantle is one of great importance. It is something that they would wear across their shoulders. Now we don't have a certain fabric garment that we can go to an op shop and say, I would like to buy a mantle of fatherhood. We don't have that privilege. But it's more of an ideology. It's more of a focus of what we want to accomplish. And so I want to just point out that in wearing the mantle of fatherhood, one of the greatest things that we can do is to be a servant to our family. And so we want to talk about that. What might God do if you embrace your leadership mandate? For starters, God might restore relationships among your family. It's sad sometimes when we hear of fathers being this way, mothers being this way. And I mentioned that in the last talk, to where there's a great divide between visions of fathers and mothers. Let me read to you just some of the ideology differences that sometimes come out in especially the home education front. Here is it's a story of a homeschool convention. Nancy enters our display booth at a homeschool convention. 3 of her 8 children accompany her as she browses and inquires about social studies. Where is her husband? Carla ambles in with 2 primary age children. Her husband Bill is 10 steps behind. I try to engage him in conversation. How long have you been homeschooling, I ask. Well, let's see. She started right after I switched jobs, so it must have been about 4 years ago. Which curriculum do you use? Oh, you got me there. Ask her. She's the teacher. He picks up a textbook on small engine repair and absently thumbs through it. Bill, thanks for coming by, I offer as I step over to Carla to answer a question. Yeah, it was my day off. Too messy to go fishing today, so I decided to come with her. He and his 8-year-old son step across the aisle to check out the kite display. Dad's here, but he's clueless, I think. Now picture that with this contrast. Neil and his wife Kathy enter the booth with their 4 children. Hi, he greets as Kathy restrains the children's delight over seeing all the books. We're not quite satisfied with the math curriculum we've been using and have been looking for something else. Can you tell us about your math program? Now, here is Dad. Now the reason I shared that story with you is one was engaged, the other one was disengaged. One was active, the other one was passive. And probably if I would have to sum it all up, the problem that I see facing many, even Christian fathers today is passivity. She'll be right. Let it all happen. Andrew and I were talking about it yesterday, the term whatever. Just this idea that, yep, it's her job, it's her calling, I'll make the living, you do the teaching, etc. So for starters, if we wear the mantle, it could restore that relationship with you and your wife. If you really understand that wearing the mantle of fatherhood is so important. Secondly, God could use you to transform your workplace. I have a book chapter right here, What God Does When Men Lead. The author is Bill Peel. If you get a chance, read that book sometime. He also has written one called Workplace Grace, what God can do with godly men in business in an environment that is hostile to Christianity, what God can still do with you in those circumstances to where people are able to come to you and say, I notice there's something different about your work ethic. I notice there's something different about your speech. Can you tell me more about why you are the way that you are? Those are opportunities. And again, I want to point out, we maybe can't do a whole population of feeding 5,000 with 5 loaves and 2 fishes. But God can use you individually, young men, older men, grandfathers, whoever you are. He can do that to help you accomplish the purposes that He wants you to do. So He could transform your workplace. Thirdly, He could make you a seen or unseen force that changes your church for God's glory. And probably one of the puzzling and sometimes troubling thoughts that come my way. Like I said earlier, I talk to a lot of people on the phone, lots of emails from disgruntled people, disgruntled with church people. Oftentimes they have gone the whole circle of churches, they've tried this, they've tried that, and often it's the complaint about such a watered down gospel, such a compromised gospel, and there's so much out there, and finally they just have kind of thrown up their hands in despair and say, what's the use? And then they go down the road of isolationism to where that there is, after all, the church is the family is the church, that mentality. I would suggest to us that the church is much bigger than my family. Yes, as Andrew has said very well, it does take families to have a church, but the church is not necessarily your family at home all by itself. I would like to encourage us to encourage other families. You need the body as part of your life. I have worked with many, many people that have felt like I don't need the church because, after all, we are the church. I can have Holy Communion at home with my wife just as well as I can anywhere else, etc., etc. I believe that God has a bigger picture in mind for the Church of Jesus Christ. So He could make you a seen or unseen force in transforming that mentality. He could use you to bring justice and fairness and morality back to your community. Sometimes we go down the wrong pathway of thinking that it's always up to somebody else to fix the problems of morality. The job of fixing morality is up to Christians, especially to fathers. Yes, we do long for government officials to embrace morality, but the Bible indicates that this world is going to get more wicked and more wicked. The fabric of society and morality is going to keep going downward, downward, downward. And I believe it's largely the fault of fathers and church leaders not standing up for truth. And so if you take up the mantle, fathers, I am persuaded that God can use you to actually transform a community to where there will be a salt and light, whether it's in Gympie, whether it's in Brisbane, whether it's in wherever you live. God can use you to make a difference in that way. He could also cause your influence to discourage abuse, because people will see how you handle your family, how you treat your wife. They will say, well, there must be a better way. And that's what gives people hope, is when they understand there's something better out there than what I have. There's a saying that goes like this: if we always do what we've always done, we'll always get what we've always gotten. So be willing to step it up a notch. Be willing to step out against the flow and not be satisfied with status quo. Let me repeat that quote again. If we always do what we've always done, we'll always get what we've always gotten. And ultimately, God could use you to change the world if you take up that mantle of leadership as a servant. What might happen if you don't take the call to leadership seriously? Well, all you have to do is watch the evening news, and you'll discover what happens when people don't take leadership seriously. All the killings, just in Dallas, Texas recently, 5 cops were shot. You look at the evening news, it's a sad picture of where people have left the situation of morality to everybody's description and everybody's definition of how it should be. Let's move on. We want to talk about leadership. In pre-1980, or somewhere around that time, there was a certain shift around that time in what is defined by leadership. Up until that time, we talked about managers and managing. We talked about people who were trained and could get things done. Leadership was considered more of a personality trait than it was a professional skill. Around 1980 or 85, somewhere around that, there was a shift to where that instead of leadership being a quality character trait, it became a professional skill. And so people like Lee Iacocca, Ronald Reagan, and maybe even politicians of today, they were considered real leaders because of their charismatic nature, because of their ability to get things done. But I would suggest to us that leadership is a character trait. It's something that we develop within our spirit. And that's why I'm stressing to us the importance of servant leadership. See, up at the top is where many people want to get. And it's this whole thing of what I call the dandelion spirit. I mentioned to you the tall poppy syndrome, where you are kind of pulled down because of your wanting to stand against the flow. And especially in developing countries, that's often the case. People that want to rise above the standard of society, they're often pulled down. What do you think you're doing? Stepping out and getting your head above the rest of us. The tall dandelion spirit is just the opposite. It's to where it doesn't matter how tall I am, as long as I'm taller than you are. Okay? And so many people in corporations and even in churches and politics many times, they will use that ladder of climbing higher, getting to the pinnacle of their success. And if you understand a step ladder, it often narrows up to the top. And there's a little perch up on the top. And as long as I can be up there, I'm happy. That's what they think. But I would like to stress to us this afternoon that up there is much more competition. There's many people that are trying to get up there. And just remember this, the further up you go, the harder it hurts. The more it hurts when you fall, because there's further to fall. If you happen to fall from a lower perch, it doesn't really hurt that badly. But I would suggest to us there's much more room for doing God's work when you're down close to the bottom of that ladder. So don't try to climb that pinnacle of success. Rather be a servant leader. It's important that we understand what leadership is all about. Let's move on. Leadership is a character trait. And here are just some points that I want to bring out. A leader provides vision and direction. And that's what you're called to do as a father. This is the mantle that he wants you to embrace, is that I give vision and direction. I don't need to do everything for my family, but I give the vision and direction for my family. He exercises faith and looks for opportunities. You know, if my son is interested in woodworking, for instance, I may not be interested in woodworking. But if my son is, I will look for opportunities to enhance his vision of being a woodworker. And so I will make it possible for him to have tools. I'll make it possible for him to have training. I'll make it possible for him to do all sorts of things so that he can develop his gifts that God has blessed him with. Thirdly, a leader deals with concepts and seeks to effectively implement them. So he's not just this visionary, to where I have these lofty ideas, but I have no idea how to get them done. A true leader, yes, has a vision for what can be done, but he also is realistic and goes about to effectively implement them into a family setting, into a church setting, and into a school setting, whatever setting you may find yourself in. Going on to attributes for good leadership, I think it's important that we understand the concept of being a servant. Moses is probably one of the best examples of this. Moses recognized the fact that he was chosen by God to be a leader. And he took things into his own hand. And he went out there and he tried to get it done in his own power. Well, we see he miserably failed. He failed in a way that many of us sometimes do when we get this urge to do something great. We take things into our own hands, do it in our own timing, do it in our own methods, and we fail miserably. And so, Moses, he probably knew from a very young age that he was a man of destiny and purpose. But he took things out of God's timing, God's ways, and did not realize the concept that God's ways are not our ways and God's thoughts are not our thoughts. We have to be part of God's plan and agenda for God to effectively use us. So a servant heart. The first 40 years of Moses' life, he thought he was somebody. He tried to do things in his own power. Now we know that as a result of what he did, of killing that manager of the Egyptian regime, he fled for his life. In that next 40-year period, he really felt himself as a nobody. Remember when God found him again out in the backside of the desert? He came to him and said, I want you to go back to, those people back there. 40 years ago, remember Moses? He said, absolutely not. I can't do that. Don't you know that they're seeking for my life? Don't you remember what happened, God? And so he had gone from feeling like he was somebody to being a nobody. I can't do anything, God. I'm not able to do this. But then God kept working with him, revealing himself in the burning bush and revealing his glory and majesty to him. And those third 40 years of Moses' life, he went from a somebody to a nobody to the place where I would like for us to come to as fathers as well. What God can do in making something out of a nobody. We do feel ourselves at times as very inadequate. But let's remember that when God is able to work with us, He is able to make something out of our life. And as we do that, He uses us to fulfill His purposes and His calling. So a servant heart, a humble spirit. We were talking back in the back earlier about, do we want our children to follow us and be like us? And we all came to the conclusion that no, there's too many blunders and problems and habits and undisciplined motives in our heart that, no, I don't want my child to be like me. And that's probably the feeling of all of us, is that we're not qualified to be that example. But we were sharing together how that if we really feel that way, that in essence is a sign of humility, that we recognize our blunders and our faults and our problems, and our children probably should rather see that aspect of our life than an arrogant feeling, I am the dad, I do all things well, become like me, and you'll have everything good for your life. You see, our sons especially, they see right through that facade. They understand that even if we have that sentiment and mentality, we're not being sincere. So humility is like the salt that melts the ice of pride. So when we display that humility of, son, I failed. I spoke harshly to my wife. I did not deal with this relationship problem well in church. I was a failure. I did this. I have sinned, son. Would you forgive me? When they see that, I think it's more important for them to see humility than it is perfection. So develop a humble spirit. Part of a good leadership as fathers is also developing an interdependence. And interdependence is, and I want to describe that to you. We sometimes think that we don't need help. So we're independent. We do things on our own. We don't need other men in our lives. So we have this independent spirit. After all, I'm a man. We get that feeling sometimes. I don't need other men. I remember a time in my life when I somewhat prided myself on my inability to be hurt by people. I could have things said about me, to me, against me, and I would kind of like just let water roll off the back like a duck. God got a hold of me one time and told me, he said, Jason, that is not a quality. That's actually hardness of heart. When we do not have the ability to feel pain and feel hurt and feel rejection, that is not necessarily a sign of manhood. When we're so tough and rough and able to absorb, it's actually a sign of callousness. And I would encourage us as men, let's not go down that road of developing an independent spirit to where we don't need or we can't feel anything that others say and do to us. The second problem is when there is a dependent spirit, to where that everything that I do, I'm depending on everybody else to supply my need and my desires. I can't do it, therefore others have to do it for me. That's also wrong. But I would like to stress to us the third, which is, I believe, a biblical concept, and that is an interdependent spirit. You see, there's a difference between a producer and a consumer. Many fathers that I deal with, I would have to, if I give commentary on their life, I would say they're a consumer. They're in consumer mode. What can I get out of this? What can I get out of this relationship? What can I receive from this? But there's a difference between a consumer and a producer. A producer needs to consume, needs to take some in, but it's also that principle of synergism. I receive so I can give. And so we must not adopt the consumer mentality, but adopt the producer mentality. What you have is meant to be given away. The Bible talks about, what do you have that you did not receive? So therefore, what you receive is not your own, but you're using it, God is using you as a channel to do His work. Develop an interdependent spirit. Here's what we mean by that. I need to engage responsibly. So inter is I need to engage responsibly. Let's remember that as we go through life, that we will be interdependent upon others to help us become what God wants us to be. Just a few more thoughts on that. By giving the home education process all the tools and support it needs to succeed. Now, we mentioned earlier that we're not asking fathers to step into the homeschool classroom and begin teaching math, science, social studies, language arts, English, word building, etc. We're not asking you to do that, but what we are suggesting to us is empower your homeschool, your home education process, to have all the tools they need. My wife recently came to me and said that, Jason, we need more space. We need more cabinet space in the schoolroom. And so we went to Bunnings that afternoon and we bought some cabinet work and we installed that. And I try to make sure that my wife has all the tools she needs, to have every resource that she needs. They don't need to be struggling for books and dictionaries and encyclopedias or new software on the computer or even a computer. And, sometimes it's very painful for wives to struggle with knowing, do I have enough material? Do I have the tools I need? When they see maybe out in your workshop, you have the latest, the best, the biggest, and the most. I'd like to suggest to us not only in the school classroom, but in the kitchen, in the laundry room, in those areas where it will help them to be more effective. Let's engage responsibly so that they can have all the tools they need to accomplish what God wants them to do. Let's move on. We want to talk about some parenting or teaching styles now. This is something that is helpful to teachers and teacher training that we do at times, but it also is very helpful in parenting. There are, in the early 1970s, there was a study done of about 4,000 teenagers. They were trying to discover what caused poor relationships between parents and their teenagers, and what then drove those same teenagers to leave the church or to leave the belief of that family. So if a church family is growing up in a Baptist setting, why did those children leave that faith and go somewhere else or become non-religious in a larger extent of the word? And so there was an interesting study done as to what caused that. There are 4 words that I would like for us to understand. These are the 4 teaching and parenting styles. One is neglectful. And that word simply means leaving undone or unattended, especially when careless. So that is one parenting style that will come out. And usually there's about 4 categories of parenting styles. So this is definitely one of them, neglectful. They just let the children do what they want because they're neglectful. Second one is permissive. And that is lacking in being firm or in control. Very tolerant of whatever the children want to do, that's what they're allowed to do. The third one is authoritarian, which is stressing power and leadership, blind obedience and submission. For example, an army commander. March when I say march. Jump when I say jump. Do what I say. Do it now. That mentality of you don't ask questions. You simply do what you're told to do, and you do it well, you do it, and you do it very rigidly, etc. That's authoritarian. The fourth one that I want to introduce is authoritative. And that is simply loving leadership that leads from a position of servanthood. So we have neglectful, which is leaving things undone, not tying up the loose ends. Permissive is just letting the child run at will as to what they want to do. So we want to explore those in more detail. So we have here the neglectful parent. And these are key words to remember. The neglectful parent is low in discipline and low in love. So he's not really loving his family. He's out, if he has a chance to go fishing when he maybe should be working at home, he goes fishing. He's simply self-oriented. He's neglectful. He's serving self. He's not serving his family. He's low in discipline. He's low in love. So this kind of dad flees his responsibility. The second one is the permissive parent. He is high in love, but low in discipline. And we have seen parents like that as well. I love my little child too much to spank him. I just love him so much. Isn't he so cute when he does that naughty little thing? I just love my little child. Instead of nipping it in the bud and taking care of the issue. So he's very high in love. He has deep affection for his children, but not to the point of true love that chastens that little son and helps him to a life of discipline. So he's high in love and low in discipline. That child, as he grows up, especially as a teenager, that dad, that mom, will fear to do anything with that child for fear that child may not love him in return anymore. So if that child wants to do something that he knows he should not do, the dad will say, okay, we can't really say anything about that because if we do, he may leave home. He may run away. He may choose other methods than to be at home with us. So the permissive parent is high in love and low in discipline. The third parent is, here we go, the authoritarian parent. Now what we mean by authoritarian is like I described as the army commander. He is high in discipline. Everything goes like clockwork. He's high in discipline, but very low in love. So he doesn't have much affection for his children, but he wants his children to do what they're told, when they're told to do it, and everything is just 100%. It's all about me, and my children are like robots. This type of dad will fight with his teenagers, I promise you. I promise you this type of dad will fight with his children because there comes a point in life when teenagers, they will rebel against and will challenge everything that dad says. So, the fourth parent is high in love and high in discipline, and he fellowships with his children. And that's the point I want to make to us. We must have authority, but let's not be authoritarian, but authoritative. And we want to discover more about that as we go through here. This research project surveyed the 4 responses of children from these 4 groups of parents. And these were the 4 areas that they looked at. One was self-image. What did they think about themselves? Second one was how did they respond to discipline? How acceptant of their parents' religion were they? And how acceptant of their parents' lifestyle and culture? And I want to just point out to us, when the attitude of the parent was low, again, the level of discipline was low, the level of love was low, he flees his children, he flees the responsibility. It's just reiterating again what we said earlier. Low and high on the permissive side. Authoritarian was high on discipline, low on love. And then the authoritative was high on discipline and love. And we experienced that fellowship with the children. Now, here is where the response of the children comes in very interesting. So in the 4,000 teenagers that they interviewed, the authoritative parent, the response of the children to that was number one in portraying a good self-image. Number two was the authoritarian. Number three was a neglectful parent. And number four was a permissive parent. So number one is the best. Authoritative, the child had a good self-image. Here's the next one. The response to discipline. Again, authoritative was number one. Number two was permissive. And number three was neglectful. And number four, authoritarian. So an authoritarian parent does not have a good response from discipline to his children. The children will rebel against that. If they are an authoritarian, they often will discipline in anger. And that's always a no-no. I remember a time, and my dad was not a perfect dad by any means, but there was one time, I got many smacks, but there was one time that I clearly remember that he disciplined me in anger. And I can still picture where I was, what he used, the tone of his voice, etc. Now the other times, many other times he did it in true love. I don't really remember those. But the time that he did that, it's vividly imprinted in my mind. And I probably am still suffering some emotional pain as a result of that. And I would encourage us, when we use authoritative measures, high in love, high in discipline, we have the best response to discipline. It's still a mystery to me how that if I take my little son, my little girl, whoever it may be, and I discipline them in true godly love, parental love, and I inflict pain upon them. I do things that make them cry. I do things that make me cry. I do that to them. And I hold them at arm's length after they have gone through that episode. And I always hold them at arm's length until they say, "Dad, I'm sorry." And then as soon as they say that, they're straight into my arms. That's a mystery to me. I have just hurt that little child. I have just inflicted pain on that little child. But the ways of God, if we do it God's way, it will help them to an actual life of discipline. So may God help us in that. Now, the third one, we're interested in our children following in our faith. Remember, the mantle that Elisha picked up from Elijah. Again, authoritative parents, the acceptance of religion, number one, permissive parents, number two, authoritarian, number four. And that doesn't surprise us because oftentimes authoritarian parents, the children will react to that and go completely the opposite way. The fourth one, acceptance of lifestyle. Again, authoritative, number one, and authoritarian, number four. And just in summary, look across that chart. All of the things that were surveyed in those 4,000 teenagers, it came through that number one every time was an authoritative parent. And most times authoritarian was the most harming and the one that was rejected the most often. So what does that mean for parents? It reveals that an adult's authority can greatly affect the character and response of a child. How you deal with authority. You see, if Elisha would have taken that mantle and said, "I've got Elijah's mantle. You do as I say." He didn't do that, but he actually exhibited the spirit of Elijah. And as he did that, his life became effective. It does take love, courage, energy, and persistence to be an authoritative parent who also fellowships with his children. I love seeing fathers and sons, fathers and daughters, and mothers and sons fellowship with each other. You know, my family, my personal family as a child, we were not very touchy. We didn't give hugs. We didn't put our arms around our mother, etc. We weren't that kind of people. But I praise God that it's nothing unusual for me to walk in my house and to see my 14-year-old son with his arm around his sister. They love each other. They're fellowshipping together. It's appropriate. It's not an inappropriate measure by any means. It's a joy to see my wife and our daughters, giving each other hugs in the morning when they see each other. It's nothing unusual for when I come home from a day in the office, which is beside the house, and I haven't seen my children much that day. They come up and give me a hug. That's fellowship. And we need that. We need a strong, cohesive family unit if we want to be the salt and light in the communities in which we live. But that means a lot to us. How we deal with authority. Now, one thing I always fear at seminars and conferences and presentations like this is sometimes we go home and we're charged up with, well, the speaker said if I follow point A, point B, point C, and I do it this certain way, these will be the results. And they go home and they implement a whole lot of new rules, and this is the way it's going to be from now on. Dear people, it takes the wisdom and grace of God. Move in God's timing if you want God's results to bless your family. That concludes my little session for this afternoon, and I want us to be considerate of the mantle that God has placed upon your shoulders. When you became fathers, the mantle was put on your shoulders. You have an obligation and a burden to bear, but God is faithful and He will give you grace so that at the end of the day, you will say, it is God who works in me both to will and to do of His good pleasure. May God bless you as you implement the mantle of fatherhood.